Joining me now to talk about that are Liberal MP for downtown Ottawa and Emergency Preparedness Parliamentary Secretary Yasser Naqvi and Conservative MP Larry Brock. He's a member of the Special Joint Committee on the Declaration of the Emergency. Now, we did invite the NDP to join this panel. We were told none of their MPs were available, but thank you both for being here. Mr. Naqvi, I'm going to start with you. The Prime Minister testified today that very early on there were concerns about the convoy and how different it would be from other protests this city has seen, and more specifically, your riding. Now, that lasted for weeks, leading to the blockades at border crossings and angering the White House. If this was such a concern so early on, why didn't the federal government do something sooner to prevent this from getting out of control?
Well, thank you. I think the Prime Minister was very clear in terms of the kind of engagement federal government had in during that entire period from the very beginning. I had spoken to the Prime Minister, and I was as a local member of Parliament, was in constant contact with other ministers like Blair and Mendocino, working along with my other colleagues. But we also had to be, of course, respectful of Ottawa Police Service, who's responsible to ensure that citizens and our city is safe. But it was very clear after almost 2 weeks of that occupation that it continued on, that something had to be done. And of course, the Prime Minister and his cabinet had to really weigh all the factors, as we heard from him and other cabinet ministers during the Commission's testimony, to make the decision as to what steps federal government can take. And it was the big one, which was to invoke the Emergencies Act, but it was clearly had to be done because the occupation in Ottawa was illegal. It was not peaceful, not to mention the blockades we were seeing at the borders in Windsor and Coutts and other places. The fact that weapons were found in Coutts, and there was the concern that some of those blockades of our borders may happen again. And that's why it was really important to invoke the Emergencies Act. And the proof is that the occupation ended and the blockades did not happen again.
But with respect, Mr. Naqvi, I mean, there were text messages that showed Minister Lametti offering up, or at least bringing up, the specter of the Emergencies Act on January 30th. So why did it take until the 14th of February?
Well, I think as we've heard, I mean, invocation of Emergencies Act is a very significant step. It's something that has never been done. So government had to take all necessary caution and due diligence in order to make that decision. But we were just—
So it wasn't the pressure from the U.S. and the Biden administration in that call? Mr. Naqvi, well, so it wasn't the pressure from the U.S. in that call a few days before the invocation that was really the decision maker?
That's obviously one of the factors, because we need to make sure that our economy remains vibrant and one of the most busiest border does not remain shut. But I think what was happening in Ottawa, and the fact that the federal government was working really closely with City of Ottawa and City of Windsor, for instance, in making sure that they have all the necessary resources to control that illegal occupation and put to an end, is an example that the federal government was involved from the very beginning, but was very cautious in invoking the Emergencies Act, and did so at a time when it was clear that there was no other tools left to end the occupation.
Mr. Brock, I'm going to bring you in now. Part of the readout of conversations that we had seen over the course of the last 2 days were between then interim Conservative leader Candice Bergen and the Prime Minister. It showed Ms. Bergen agreeing with the Prime Minister when he said he was worried about setting a precedent that people need to set up a blockade on Wellington Street to get what they want. So she was on board with that, and she agreed about not setting that precedent. However, we also know that she emailed senior Conservatives around that time saying that she didn't want the Conservatives to be asking protesters to go home, adding, quote, "We need to turn this into the Prime Minister's problem." So which one was it?
I'll be very clear, Michael. Firstly, thank you for the opportunity to speak to this issue. Our former leader was very clear. She was very much engaged with the Prime Minister in trying to get him to lower the temperature. We have to remember that it was the Prime Minister's extremely negative rhetoric with respect to the characterization of those who were protesting. He was wedging, he was stigmatizing, he was disagreeing with those who disagreed with those health mandates. We impressed upon the Prime Minister to engage in some fashion. The protesters wanted a conversation with members of the government. For whatever reason, the government chose not to engage. Other protests on the Hill, they have. In this particular case, they did not. So it was a fine line that the former leader of the Conservative Party wanted to make, but she wanted to stress that an effective resolution of this matter required the Prime Minister to lower the dialogue, lower the temperature, and to engage.
Is lowering the temperature saying to senior Conservatives we need to turn this into the Prime Minister's problem?
No, not at all. I think it's a matter of showing respect. Whether you disagree with those individuals who came to Ottawa from across this country for a number of reasons, it's all about showing fellow Canadians respect. We may disagree with their motivation. We may disagree with their views with respect to the federal mandates and the vaccinations, et cetera. But you can get further with showing some respect and some consideration than the way that the Prime Minister and members of his cabinet and his party did so.
Mr. Naqvi, I wanted to look forward a bit with you here. What do you think came out of this commission that future governments can learn from when it comes to these types of large-scale movements, which, let's face it, aren't going away?
Yeah, no, that's a very good question, and I think there's a collective learning for all of us throughout this process. I think what's remarkable and unprecedented about this whole process is the level of transparency that Emergencies Act requires, and the government is following through in terms of, I mean, just witnessing today that the Prime Minister of Canada testified under oath for 6 hours. Cabinet confidences were waived, and there's this extraordinary transparency to ensure that Canadians understand how important decisions like invoking the Emergencies Act were made. I am sure that there is going to be recommendations from Justice Rouleau. Mr. Brock and I are part of a joint parliamentary committee that's going to be also writing a report that will allow us hopefully to improve the Emergencies Act, but also to ensure that we all collectively learn lessons as to how to deal with situations like this if they happen again in the future.
Mr. Brock, I've only got about 30 seconds, but I do want to give you a chance to respond to this. What does this mean about how we engage with these types of protests going forward? Because I think that's important for all politicians to look at going forward.
That's a very good question, Michael, and I raised that last evening, actually, at the Joint Special Committee when we had Mayor Dilkens from Windsor who testified. And in my view, I had the first opportunity to question him, and I viewed it almost as a gold standard in terms of the approaches that they took to engage not only the local police service, but the OPP, the RCMP, engaging with federal ministers, engaging with the Prime Minister. There was a coordinated communication plan. There was daily dialogue with the protesters. They lowered the temperature. They continued to recommend that they take appropriate steps to clear the bridge and to allow the free trade to continue between our two nations. And through effective policing, respect, and dialogue, that was successfully completed well before the invocation of the Emergencies Act.
Larry Brock, Yasser Naqvi, thank you so much for joining us. Have a great weekend.
Thank you.
Thank you.
You as well.